Welcome to Shop Talks, which is a project of In Kitchen, Impressions, sponsored by Hanes and Hirsch. And our first Shop Talk today is about dye migration. I've got with me my old pal Rob Coleman, who
Hello.
He's the VP of Textile, all things textile at Nazdar, and he has agreed to talk about dye migration. So, Rob, what is dye migration?
Oh wow! How much time do we have? This is a topic. Actually, we could spend hours talking about. And specifically, if you go and you look and you see people discussing it in social media platforms, and I see a lot of I say misinformation. People sometimes can confuse dye sublimation and dye migration, while the effect may be the same. Is a bad print, right? They are two complete different phenomena. So I guess in its most basic form, what dye migration is, specifically when we're talking about polyester dyes, is that those dyes actually become solvated with a plasticizer and a plastisol ink, and it rises up through the surface over time. It could happen 2 hours, 24 hours, 2 weeks, post-migration. And so, the classic case of what we call bleeding or dye migration would be white ink on a red polyester garment, and then that white ink film over time becomes pink.
So I think the scariest thing is that, and I think we've all been there when we first start in the industry, is you print a beautiful white print, and it looks great at the end of the dryer, and everybody folds them up and they put them in the boxes, and worst case, what happens is the customer gets it 3 days later via UPS, opens it, and is ready to kill you because the ink turns pink.
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of like the hidden killer, because they look first quality, they look great when you pack them up. So, there's lots of ways to prevent it. You have to have a robust ink designed to print on polyester as a blocker, and not all inks are the same for certain. I guess I would classify it as you have some general purpose bleed resistant white inks that are really designed more for blended garments, 50/50s. But if you're printing on 100% polyester, that's a whole different breed. You need something very, very robust.
So I just thought you just print the white ink really, really thick and it covers it. Doesn't that work?
Absolutely. And ink manufacturers love that, double it up. But
no, actually, I think that is people's first reaction, is that they'll just print a thicker white film. You want to we'll both talk about what's wrong with that?
Sure. I mean, really all you're doing is delaying it. I mean, it's if you have an ink film that's that thick, is if it's going to have dye migration, if you are slightly undercured on the ink film, or if it's not robust enough to block those dyes, it will eventually make its way to the surface. You're just really delaying it.
Actually, I always tell people it actually makes it worse, because if you have thick white ink, you're going to have to use more heat to cure it, and when you do that, the inevitable is going to happen. I mean, I mean, it's a beginner's mistake. I mean, you would think, if it's going to come out, I'll just coat it and it won't come out, but it does. It will always make its way through the ink.
There's no doubt, and a big part of this, and I don't see it as much now as I say if we roll the clock back, 10, 15, even 20 years ago. I think there's a lot better curing mechanisms, whether they be electric or gas or combo dryers. But historically, undercured ink film was, I would say, right up there as kind of a 90 percentile cause of the dye migration. Because what happens, I could have the most robust ink possible, but if I am even slightly undercured, that means there's still some available plasticizer that has not been absorbed by the PVC resin in the case of a plastisol, and it will make its way down and basically solvate those dyes and bring them through the ink surface.
So let's talk just a little bit about some of the more difficult fabrics. I mean, I think when I first started, and maybe when you started, you could use, like you said, an all-purpose ink. If you thought your employees were not going to be diligent about it, just use the quote-unquote 50/50 ink, and it would kind of work on almost everything. Well, with the plethora of shirts that are available out there, that's no longer possible, and you need to pick your ink carefully for what you're doing. So what do you do with digital camo? That I know that comes up a lot. One of the worst bleeding things is that the polyester with digital camo will come through the ink film and ruin your print. So what do you do about in the worst cases? What are some of those techniques?
Yeah, those are absolutely a challenge because we're dealing with a really kind of ultimately it's the same phenomena, but a different ink chemistry that's causing it. In my view, really the only way to be confident that you're going to be able to block those dyes from moving is to use a very robust barrier product. All the brands make them. Rutland, Wilflex, International Coatings. Everybody makes it's either a gray or a black, and that would have to go down first.
I remember hearing that and thinking, this is crazy. You want a good white ink and you start with black. You want to explain what that is for people that may not know what that is?
Yeah, that is.
Because I think people think you're pulling their leg. All right, so we're going to print white ink, and we're going to use black to make it whiter. Can you explain?
Yeah, that kind of defies a bit of logic, doesn't it? And to be clear, it's not just a black ink, okay? I'm just not going to take my general purpose black that I'd be printing on white T-shirts. No. The reason it's black or maybe a dark shade of gray, it actually uses it's a carbon, black pigment. So what that carbon does, ultimately, think of how charcoal works in a filter. It's actually absorbing those dyes as they move. So regular black ink, those dyes will just go right through it. But the carbon part of these blockers absolutely absorbs it, stops it. Once you have that done, then you can print. Still, you need somewhat of a robust white. You still want to put a bleed-resistant white on top of the black.
And then part of it is also some of the inks, it's the heat, like in that they cure at a lower temperature. You have inks probably that do that as well, right? That will stop some of the migration.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, and actually that's a bit of somewhat of where I see some of the struggles with communication out in the marketplace is everybody talks low cure, low cure. All I need is a low cure ink and that's going to stop bleeding. And that really is not true. What that does, let me back up a minute. In the old days, you never had to worry about dye sublimation, really. And what I mean by that is if I'm printing that white ink on a red polyester shirt and it's turning pink at the very end of the dryer, that's actually a sublimation. That the dyes in the polyester are going from a solid to a gas and immediately changing color. Right. So that's 100% heat driven. And in the old days, most of the mills use high energy dyes. So they set those dyes, let's call it 360 degrees Fahrenheit, just to pick a number. And nobody was getting their ink temperatures that hot, right? We need 320 to cure. But what's happened over time is most all of the mills use lower energy, lower costing dyes so that when they're setting them at lower temperatures. So let's say, again, to pick a number, if they set that dye at 300 degrees Fahrenheit, anything above that is going to make those move. That's why you need a low cure product to stop sublimation. But I could take a low cure white ink that has no bleed resistant properties. I could print it, cure it at that temperature, and it would still potentially post bleed. So there are two different phenomena kind of handled, with one type of product, if that makes sense.
So another thing I wanted to talk about was the original Antibleed inks were really thick. They were like printing concrete. So there's been some advances as people have to deal with this problem, right? I know Rutland makes a product, Endurance Gray. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the solutions that work a little better to keep the print soft?
Yeah, and you're right. If you've got a very viscous product, and some of them still are, and it's the nature of the beast. I always say, the eye of Newt and the bat wing that the manufacturers are putting in there, right? And many times it's not good for the stability of the product. First and foremost, I'd say before you print anything, make sure we're shearing it up. Put it on a turnabout. If you don't have a turnabout, get a mixer, do something. You don't want to throw a lot of heat at it, but you want to move that ink because it many times it's a bit of a false body. Yeah. And then we can control our deposits through our standard procedures. Mesh counts, stencil thickness, the marrying up the right type of squeegee to make certain that, what we want to do is not drive that ink into the garment, right? So if I can lay it on top, use less ink and form a better barrier, ultimately it's going to give me a bit of a softer hand.
The other thing we've also found, and it's really hard to explain to customers, is that multiple coats sometimes are lighter coats in the end. So that if you put the barrier down in a couple coats of white, maybe 3 whites, that you will actually get thinner. The only way I've been able to explain it is like if you had a black wall at your house and you want to paint it white. If you tried to do it in one coat, what would that look like?
No, that's absolutely a great point. And many times, specifically people, I would say, that are limited on their screen, number of screens they have on their press, or if they're printing manually, don't want to have to do that. But at the end of the day, I would absolutely say, if I had 2 white screens, I could get a more opaque, softer hand, better finish than trying to do it on one. Because if you think about it, once that first one goes down and we flash it off, we're no longer t-shirt printers. We're printing on vinyl, right?
Yeah, right.
You know, so that the ink has nowhere to go but up.
So just to scare people even more, there are some problems sometimes with using low bleed white. Like if you just use low bleed white, some low bleed whites will ghost on cotton. Is this true?
Wow, yes. And it's interesting because years back, all the ink manufacturers, for their bleed resistance, they used peroxide. Peroxide was what was put in the inks to help, with the dye migration. They worked great. Unfortunately, peroxide generally stinks. You smell it, right? And so at retail, there's nothing worse than open up a poly bag shirt and catching that odor of peroxide. So probably starting back in the mid-90s, most of the ink companies started using different chemistry that was really, let's just call it an expansion agent. Not like a puff, what people think of, but it is a slight expansion agent.
Well, what people call blowing agents sometimes.
Exactly. Yes, exactly right. Yeah. And the problem, they work very well, but what you refer to as ghosting is I guess, an unfortunate potential side effect of using that chemistry. So what that means, if I'm printing on a cotton shirt primarily, and I stack hot, if the conditions are right, you got to have the ink that has that ingredient, you have to have heat, and you have to have moisture, humidity, and then some level of pressure of stacking. I've got that white image, I stack hot, and next thing you know, I've got the ghost image on the back of the shirt.
A mirror image of it, actually.
Well played. Well played. Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah.
You've been thinking how you're going to get that in, right? Yeah.
So, I think we covered most things about this. As you said, we could talk for hours. Any last thoughts of how people can deal with this? And actually, one other, I want to plug somebody. I think one thing that we're seeing a little better is information from the shirt people. I think the ink folks like you got blamed all the time. Hey, my ink won't work on this shirt. More and more, I know there's cooperation. Like Sam, I know, has their decorator network, and they try to put together the ink people and the shirt people so people get good results. Have you seen that helping a little bit at least?
Yeah, it has to, because you're right. There really was no communication in the past, and you mentioned, I have a saying, you mentioned about blaming the ink. It's last in the process, first to blame, almost for everything. Another little favorite expression is, ink don't think. It doesn't know to work here and not work there. Right. The last thing, I guess, what I would say is there is a plethora of information out there on all these topics. There's been, over even something that, say, maybe Mark Coudray or Joe Clark authored 20 years ago is still relevant today. And all this, information, it's archived. You can search for it, you can look at it. I just say educate yourself. Be careful of some of the stuff you just read randomly on the internet, because, I know it's kind of crazy, but it's not always true, But use the resources, and every manufacturer and most distributors as well generally have a pretty good technical staff to help you out too.
Actually, I wanted one last thing that we could have started with, but it's not bad to end. So other than printing a bunch of shirts and having them ruined when your customer opens them 2 days later, what else can you do? Like, you can do a dye migration test on a garment to figure out what you're dealing with. You want to just quickly say what a dye migration test would look like?
Yeah, so you're probably talking about using the liquid?
Yeah, plasticizer.
Yeah. So it's and it's a pretty simple procedure that you do, and basically, in a nutshell, and help me out because you probably do it all the time.
Yeah.
If I were to take that substrate that is prone to dye migration, I could put a white cotton piece over it with a
So yeah, what you take is so the ink is plastisol inks are plasticizer and a resin, and it's the plasticizer that causes the problem. So there's products. They're often called non-curable reducers or different names like that. Your ink company can help you with that. You take a drop of that, you put it on a white. You put it on the fabric that you're testing. You put a piece of white cloth over it, and you
with a transfer press.
You use a transfer press for 30 seconds at 320 or whatever temperature you think you're going to be going at, and you look at it and you see how much comes off. It's a little tricky. You got to get used to it because almost always some color comes off, but if a lot comes off, you know that what we call that shirt is a bad bleeder, and you have to do something about it.
So it's really a matter of degrees of discoloration.
Right.
And really doing that as a printer, if you keep records and you use different manufacturers, different dye lots, and you kind of keep a record of what you have, then it's pretty easy to kind of predict as new jobs come in on how it will be. But anything you can do to basically predict what the outcome is going to be is going to help you out.
Right. All right. So if there's any questions. Any questions about dye migration? All right.
Hey, we either did a really good job or a really bad job.
All right.
Somewhere.
So I want to thank Rob Coleman from Nazdar.
Thank you,
and
guys.
Thank
I
our
appreciate it, Rick.
sponsors,
Absolutely.
Hanes and Hirsch, and In Kitchen. It's been the Shop Talk on dye migration. Thanks.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
That was great. Thank you.